to bring it closer to home. Coastal cities, Toni Loyzaga, Yulo Loyzaga for Manila Observatory. Please.
Thank you very much, Maria, and thank you to Shell and to all of you today for coming to Manila and actually being concerned about resilience in cities today. I've been asked to present perspectives on Metro Manila, principally from the Manila Observatory's work. And as some of you may know, we are particularly interested in the science of change, particularly climate as well as human change. Each year, the World Economic Forum releases a list of risks as well as those events that may in fact impact most on the global economy. This year, extreme weather, urbanization, and income inequality were in fact among those three trends. And right in the middle there, you see the IPCC's diagram of risk, which actually looks at climate events that have been induced by socioeconomic processes, human activities, and produce a combination of hazards, exposure, and vulnerability. In the case of Metro Manila and most of urbanizing Asia and Africa, that vulnerability is, of course, characterized by a great degree of income inequality. Globally, in 2014, more people were affected by droughts, floods, storms, rather than any hazard, a natural hazard in the globe. Majority of these people were, in fact, in Asia, Africa, and Latin America, and that's where we begin to drive home our message on urbanization. As you can see from this graphic from The Economist, most urbanization is occurring in coastal cities in Asia and Africa. And as you know, in fact, by some of the research that has been done here by Shell and others, over half of the world's 7 billion now live in cities. 30%, or 1 billion, do live in informal settlements. And that's where it actually comes home to us here in Metro Manila. In the case of the developing economies, particularly those that are just beginning to emerge from being low income and entering into the low middle income economies, we look at the ability of households, communities, and countries, in fact, to adapt, recover, and from shocks and stresses in a manner that in fact reduces chronic vulnerability. This is a definition that's being used in the development community, particularly by USAID, as it does its work in developing economies. We look at the Manila Observatory at resilience as being composed of particularly 4 types of dimensions. The physical sector, what's happening between the land, ocean, and atmosphere. We look at organizational vulnerability, what's happening in governance, who's making the decisions, what are those decisions about, who's driving those decisions. We look at social vulnerability and how that in fact is linked to the entire intersection between the physical and the organization. And lastly, who's making economic decisions and what are those economic decisions about in terms of the overall development of the economy. As you know, those of you that live here in Metro Manila, 2012 actually hit us very, very much, in fact, in the city because the southwest monsoon, which is in fact one of those climate trends that we'll be talking about, actually showed us how Mother Nature is in fact changing as we in fact have been changing the city. This is a graphic of Rojas Boulevard, the same boulevard that you are actually traversing just to come over here. And in 2012, during the southwest monsoon season, storm waves actually crossed the barriers of the boulevard and actually entered businesses. It actually entered the US Embassy and actually reached many of the big concerns that are actually along the coast. What is happening to Metro Manila and how can we change it? Metro Manila has lost much of its land cover in the span of 30 years. And as you can see from the sprawl that is shown by this graphic, we actually have in the 600 square kilometers of Metro Manila really brought down our land cover to about just over 10%. What that does to drainage systems as well as livable spaces and investment opportunities, you all know, those of you who have been living here in the city. What are we looking at the observatory? Over the 150 years of our work in climate and seismological observation, the observatory has been looking at changes in long-term climate as well as weather patterns. In the Habagat of 2013, and that's the southwest monsoon season, we saw how different rainfall intensities actually fall across different areas in the city, and we're beginning to look at patterns of change in terms of where heavy rainfall actually falls and where, in fact, the rain is distributing across the city. Models at the observatory now project that, in fact, the southwest monsoon rainfall will increase by 5 to 20% in areas including Metro Manila in the future. What that means to human systems as well as the physical systems of the city, in fact, is something that we are all beginning to grapple with in terms of resilience. What else is happening in the city? Well, as many of you know, there are many low-lying areas, particularly around the coast, where subsidence and sea level rise are already beginning to show their effect. We're looking at a set of mountains, the headwaters of our watershed, draining massive amounts of rainfall into narrowing channels, in fact, towards the Bay and Laguna and Manila Bay as well. This difficulty in drainage is not as much a problem of physical change naturally overcoming the city, but in fact of governance. We look at the major constrictions in Metro Manila's rivers and how many of these are actually what we call permitted developments, commercial, industrial, residential, that have lost much of the drainage capacity of the city. And in fact, majority of these constrictions that you have seen, which have been investigated by the Observatory and its partners, are not informal settlements, as has been repeatedly mentioned in the analysis of Metro Manila's flooding problems. Metro Manila has 4 million informal settlements, 12 million official population, 30% of them informal. The urban agglomeration, greater urban Metro Manila, has 25 million people. And in fact, flooding and other shocks to the system of the city affect a much larger population than just the city of Manila. Where you see the urban informal settlements gather, we also see some major flooding and some major drainage problems. And in fact, many of these communities live without the proper water, without the proper sanitation, without the proper healthcare and other services. So we see a major convergence between human vulnerability and physical exposure to changing climate, not just sea level rise, but ground subsidence caused by groundwater extraction, and of course, development. How do we move forward given all of these problems? And I go back to my initial diagram that I discussed earlier. On the physical spectrum, the dimension that we're all basically looking at when we look at climate change, we're looking towards ICT-enabled observation, analytics, and risk communication. And in fact, as the ambassador has mentioned earlier, great strides have been made in terms of the fine resolution mapping of Metro Manila and other cities in this country. But still, the analytics need support, and risk communication to communities are critical to bringing resilience to the forefront in terms of development patterns. Food, water, energy, and people. So not just physical changes in terms of what we are seeing from the satellites and from the ground, but also human change is necessary to observe. Now, this is already happening. There are certain examples, for example, regionally, where the space agencies are beginning to recalibrate their missions. The Manila Observatory is part of a new Asian space science and technology roadmap that's being led particularly because of ASEAN integration happening. We're also part of the World Climate Research Program's Regional Climate Downscaling Program, which will bring downscaled climate information to communities. On the organizational forefront, we're looking more and more towards evidence-based governance. We'd like resource management and access, in fact, and physical planning to be based on a continuity between science, policy, and practice. This is a challenge that we are faced with today, but I must say that strides are really being made, particularly because of the private sector initiatives like Shell, but also because some of the activism in the scientific community to bring some of this evidence forward and make them, in fact, relevant to development patterns. On the social system, and in fact, this has been already mentioned by Saya, we're looking at education, not just exchanges between higher education institutions, not just basic education, but also lifelong learning. How do we prepare ourselves for future risk? How do we transform the way they live? On the economic forum, we're looking at really models of creative reconstruction, preparing for the day after tomorrow. Not just preparing to respond to disasters, restore functionality, what is the city going to look like, but really looking at the possibility of catastrophic events really changing the landscape of our communities. How do we creatively reconstruct our future? And this is already being done in countries such as Japan and the United States. We'd like to learn more about how, in fact, creative reconstruction can be made part of our decision-making here in the developing world. Susan Kiefer, a geologist who produced a book recently on the dynamics of disasters, has talked about establishing a new disaster CDC. Is that something that has particular relevance to this part of the future where most of the people will be found in cities and most of the people will be exposed to future events such as the impacts of climate change? These are questions, in fact, that we'd like to continue to investigate together with you as partners and, in fact, begin to envision the city that all of us want, not just some of us want. And lastly, I'd like to leave you with this image. This village actually is a few kilometers down along the coast. It is called Little Samar. Those of you that know about the provinces that have been hit by Typhoon Haiyan know that Samar was the first province to be hit. And in fact, this is evidence of the kind of migration that is taking place and will continue to take place because of the exposure to hazards and the need for new opportunities that the city can bring. So on that note, I'd like to thank all of you and invite you to continue this journey with us in the future. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Toni.